Hey, Chase,
Yeah.
what's this?
What do you mean? What's what?
Is that a fake, dude?
No. That's the real deal.
I don't know about this, man. I'm pretty sure that I've seen something like this on Alvarado Street.
You may have seen something on Alvarado Street, but it's not this.
Okay, anyway.
This is kind of an oddball for sure, but it's definitely 100% legit.
So you're saying this is a real oddball?
This is a real oddball. Yeah, this is, what everybody wants to get. It's actually an uncommon or possibly rare, but definitely uncommon Rolex.
5506, right?
That's right, the 5506, the black sheep.
We're about to get the good, the bad, and the ugly on the 5506 Rolex, aka the Rolex Air King, aka a real rare Rolex.
Or actually the Rolex Explorer, which is the other reason why it's kind of an oddball.
Well, now I'm confused. Make up your mind.
No, it's both.
It can't be both.
You're normally right. And of course, for this episode of diving into the watch, we have Manuel, the watchmaker extraordinaire, who has personally gone through this piece and revived it from its original state of somewhat neglect and certainly a lot of use to tell us what is on the inside and a lot of general knowledge when it comes to shopping for vintage, in this case specifically 1500 caliber powered Rolexes.
Which is the same caliber and the 1680. Which is the red sub?
The red sub, the one that everybody is looking for. Yeah, that's a 1500 caliber. A slightly different iteration, but these are the vintage acrylics. Not all acrylics are running the 1500, obviously, but a lot of them are.
Okay, so let's talk about the history of this watch, because you did say it's legit, and I'll believe you this time.
Only this time.
Only this time, right? So you were telling me outside of the microphones that this particular watch is somewhat rare. A lot rarer, I would say, than maybe the 1680, if I'm catching on correctly here.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting piece. The question you asked me was, wow, why, if it's so rare, why aren't they worth more? And I can't answer because I don't have all the knowledge in the world, but I think it's actually too rare. There aren't enough people with these pieces to hype them up. And I don't want to use the R word, but it's definitely uncommon. And I know for a fact that it must be uncommon because it is the result of something that Rolex does not commonly do, i.e., they made a watch which is an export-only model and only made for certain markets. In this case, it was what they called a Commonwealth export model. This particular one went to Canada, and I think quite a lot of them went to Canada. Some also went to the UK, and I believe some may have went to Australia, although that's still to be confirmed. But it's an interesting effort of what they did to make a watch really as in a very high-quality Rolex way, but also very, very cost conscious.
So what you're saying is Canadians, the UK, and Australia, they're second-class citizens to Rolex?
Well, no, that's probably more the US because we got the 17 jewel models. Let's just go through the technical specs here just to get it out of the way. It's a 34 millimeter case. It's gold fill. It has a thick actual layer of gold on top of it. So people who tell you, oh, Rolex only does solid gold. No, that's definitely not true.
Right.
Now they are. Now, when you buy a modern Rolex, anything that's gold will be gold. But in times past, that was certainly not true. And this is an example of that. So it is a gold fill case. And keep in mind that it's not electroplate. It's actually a layer of gold.
And this was a common practice.
Very common because of different tariff restrictions based on the material. So they made a watch with some gold on it that was gold colored. But because it wasn't solid gold, it was taxed or tariffed at a much lower rate. Because it was a Canadian model and not a US model, it actually has a fully jeweled movement. So it's the full 26 jewel that was the highest jewel count you would get in a 1500 caliber. As opposed to the US, which I think I've said before, the US has a tariff break at the 17 jewel cutoff. So we would get the 17 jewel movements. But this, because it wasn't a US model, would have a fully jeweled movement. But then again, to make it cheaper, on the other hand, it's not chronometer certified.
So that's why it says precision on it?
That's exactly why it says precision. And actually, the common practice, when Rolex made a fully jeweled movement like this, that was not chronometer certified, it would actually say super precision.
No way.
And precision by itself was for 17 jewel models.
See, I've never seen super precisions.
They're pretty uncommon especially in the US, because there wasn't really a reason. The big difference in price came from the number of jewels. So if you were paying for more than 17 jewels, you would just get the chronometer certified one. It wasn't like there was a big difference between a super precision and a chronometer certified in this market.
You know what threw me off with this particular watch was a couple of things. So the first thing that threw me off was what it says on the dial. It says Air King A, because, you know, it's Canadian. And then the second portion is the case. It is a 34 millimeter case. It looks familiar to a Rolex case, but it's not a common Rolex case.
It's actually very uncommon, and to my knowledge, it's actually unique to this reference. The case has a slightly different shape, different angles and contours. So even though, Mike, you have a 34 millimeter, your daily wear is a 34 millimeter Rolex.
Correct.
It looks a little different. And a lot of people might look at this watch and actually think it's fake because it looks very, very similar to what you normally see, but it is a little different than what you normally see.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, it's not. The best description I can give, and there will definitely be posting pictures of this, is that it's more similar to the sport cases like the 40 millimeter, either Explorer 2, GMT, Submariner.
Right.
That shape with the flatter sides and that more squared lug contour rather than the rounded contours, but then in the 34 millimeter form.
Right. Well, I'm going to tell you my favorite and not so favorite things about this watch, but before we do that, let's get into the nitty gritty of it. So we know the history.
Yeah.
And we know how it was taxed, which is important.
Very important.
And where it was taxed. The Rolex Air King, that is this particular model, the 5506, which is also an Explorer.
Yes, it was sold as an Explorer and it was sold as an Air King. So that's kind of the other thing I was saying before. Rolex doesn't do that. They don't do it very often, and they certainly haven't done it in a long time, have one reference with two names.
Right.
Both of them are 5506, and both of them would be correct in saying either Air King or Explorer on the dial.
Okay, so are they identical literally in every way, shape, and form, other than having Explorer on the dial and Air King on the dial?
Yes. The only technical difference that has ever existed within the 5506s, because they're all the same material, is that some of them are 25 joule and some are 26. And what I've heard is that it is based on which market it was made for, because apparently one of the export markets had a tariff breakpoint at 25 joules. And so they had one less for some markets.
That's so dumb. It's not even weird. It's just dumb.
I agree. So this watch actually houses the 1530 caliber, which is the grandfather, the originator, is the first of the 1500 calibers. Of course, there were all of the variants that came out of it. The 1530, in its fully jeweled 26 joule configuration, some of them were chronometer certified because it was the first of its family that came out.
Were the subs COSC?
Well, it depends which Submariner. Some of the Submariners that had the 1530, some were certified, not all.
Like the 1680.
Well, the 1680 came out later.
But it was COSC.
The 1680s all were COSC, but also all had newer versions of the movement. The 1680s had a date. This doesn't have a date.
That's correct. And then also we were talking about balances, and apparently there's a difference there too.
There is a difference. The 1680s, all being chronometer certified, were free-sprung balances. Now, why this is important, and actually why it's really, really important, this is a huge performance advantage. And in fact, the 1500 calibers from Rolex were the first Rolex movements to have this advancement. But there's definitely somebody sitting at the table here who can better talk about a free-sprung balance.
I hope so.
Who's handled them directly and has seen them in action.
All right, so Mr. CMW21, what's the difference between a free sprung and a non-free sprung?
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to work on this 5506, by the way.
Is it real?
Of course.
Just tell me the truth.
Oh, yeah, it's real through and through, 100%. So there's two kinds of regulation methods for conventional balance wheels. One is that the regulation is through a adjustable regulator, which basically you shorten or lengthen the effective functioning length of the hairspring, therefore making it go fast or slow.
So you're not actually physically making the hairspring shorter or longer. Okay.
No, you're just basically going on either direction of the hairspring to kind of make it vibrate faster or slower.
Got it. Okay.
You know, we're talking like barely a degree or two at most.
Okay. Understood.
Okay? It's kind of like we've all done this in class. You know, you have a ruler, you put it on the side of the table, and then you kind of give the free end a little push and you watch it vibrate. And if you really want to have fun, you just shorten the length of the ruler.
While it's vibrating.
While it's vibrating, and you hear it go, bring, whatever. I don't know how that sound is. So that's kind of what you're doing with a adjustable regulator and a non-free sprung hairspring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you shorten it, you increase the frequency. I think everyone can relate to that.
Again, but you're shortening the functional, right? Not the actual hairspring.
Right. Basically, it's called the point of vibration or the vibrating point. And therefore, if it's vibrating at 18,000 beats per hour, then that's that specific point that you're going either left or right of it, just a tad.
Got it.
And for a free sprung balance is one that does not have that type of regulating system. And it's regulated, i.e., it's made to go fast or slow using inertia blocks or inertia screws on the outer portion of the balance wheel. Now, that could be in a form of screw with a slot in it. It could be, as in the case of Rolex, what's called a microstella. In the case of Patek Philippe, it's the Gyromax, which is kind of a donut with a part of it cut off.
Looks like a Pac-Man. What you're doing is you're distributing the weight or distributing the mass more outward or more inward.
Correct. The advantages and disadvantages of both. So quickly, a free-sprung regulator, balance wheel, the rate is stable over a longer period of time versus the one which has an adjustable regulator with the curb pins. Those ones, they could, after you adjust it nice and perfect over a few weeks or a few months, it may vary slightly. So that's why most chronometer grade watches tend to have free-sprung balance wheels.
I do know that in addition to this 5506 powered by a 1530, at the very same time you were working on another watch from another member of Team OTP. Mm-hmm. Our Sound Yoda had his 1680 with you, which is powered by the 1575, which is a newer version of this 1500 caliber with a date, with a free sprung balance, and running at a little bit higher frequency. But the frequency is really not the issue here. What we want to discuss is there is a myth that the 1500 calibers are indestructible and that they last forever. People seem to be going after them the way they go after these early 80s Mercedes diesels, thinking that they're these indestructible machines that never need maintenance and they'll last forever and work perfectly. But that is definitely not the case, not just from this 5506, plenty of other pieces I've had, and we're going to talk about both this and the Red Sub that were both in the hands of Manuel at pretty much the same time, so that you get an idea of what to expect when you're shopping for one of these vintage pieces. And I'll tell you right now, it's not just pick it up, squirt some oil, and it's going to be fine because it's an indestructible machine.
Well, the same thing goes with those diesel Mercedes. You have to maintain it. Come on now.
That's right. You just have to maintain everything. There's nothing that lasts that you can just neglect and it will be okay. You always have to take care of your things.
So what I wanted to say is, regardless of what case they're in, remember that these are 40, 50, 55-year-old watches on average. Mm-hmm. And anything which has been running for that long doesn't just need a cleaning and an oiling, unless it's been recently restored throughout, both mechanism and or case. But for the purposes of the movement, what is really needed is a complete rectification of all the points of wear in the movement. That means new bushings, perhaps some new center wheel, and there's a long list of items that need correction. So it's not a cheap proposition.
Just to give you all an idea of what we're talking about, some of the components in a watch travel the distance of the circumference of the Earth every year. So if you think about a machine that has gone around the world literally 60 times and you think that you don't need to correct any wear, you need to have your head examined.
Really, the only way that it wouldn't need that is if you were saying the watch was sitting still for 40 some odd years.
Right. Whatever it is. I mean, if the person got it, wound it maybe once and put it in a box and never touched it again for 45 years.
Right.
And that would be most ideal situation for a service person. And at that point, it will be a quote unquote a simple act of complete disassembly, cleaning, and then applying factory lubricants again. At that point, it would be a much easier job. But how many watches do you know that are in that type of condition?
Okay, so now I want to talk about something that I think is important for this particular watch because it is rare. And it's very comparable to the 1680 because essentially they're kind of the same thing other than a few minor nuances, which is the case, and a little bit of the detail in the movement. But really, for the most part, it's kind of sort of the same thing. So let's talk about how this thing was put together, because the general consensus of most Rolex fanboys and or people that are just aware of Rolex is that it's a very well put together watch, which is mostly true.
Yes. Mostly true.
Does this watch fit that profile?
The movement is a high caliber, high quality movement. Apart from what you said about the case, it was destined for a certain market. Despite all the abuse that it had endured, I think it was in good condition. I would say it's well fitted, well assembled case.
Okay.
It's definitely less resilient than a steel case, but possibly more resilient in some ways than maybe an 18 karat gold case.
If it's the fill, then it's just the top portion,
Right.
which is the actual gold. So if you are hitting it, say, against the bane of a watch wearer's existence, the doorknob, you are going to damage it regardless. It doesn't matter what kind of watch you're wearing, unless it's titanium, maybe.
Well, you can see the case, Mike. Because it's gold filled, it probably, I don't think it ever has been refinished. Just looking at it, I don't think this has ever seen a polishing wheel.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it.
You wouldn't want to polish it anyways.
Right, that's the point. You wouldn't want to polish this. Anybody with any amount of knowledge would know not to polish any sort of gold-plated or gold-filled watch. But why I'm saying that is, you notice there really aren't dents on the watch.
Right.
And the watch is from 1961. It's definitely not the same as a Submariner. The Submariner is a diving watch. It has the bezel. It
Right.
has a much higher depth rating. One's 40 millimeters, one's 34. It has a different form factor.
Sure.
I think what you're saying is internally, they're much more similar than they're dissimilar.
Right.
And if you increase the size of this case and put a different bezel on it, yeah, actually, I would say then it really is a Submariner.
That's a great point. And really what I was trying to say, I guess, in other words, is the construction quality that you would see in a 1680. Is the 5506 equal to the construction quality of a 1680? We're not talking about the 1680 being a stronger, bigger, heavier case for its purpose, and this one not. We're talking about quality of material, quality of craftsmanship, just overall quality. Is it on par with other Rolex watches?
Of the same era, I would say, yeah. In terms of machining, in terms of fit and finish, also good to remember that back in the old days, they had this intense desire to excel as they do today, but they were more craftsmen working in those factories. They were watch makers versus
Watch assemblers.
watch assemblers or component assemblers.
With all due respect.
Yeah. I mean, you can specialize, you can still be just as good. But, it was built by a different set of craftsmen, and that was everywhere. It was here in the US, in Europe, and so on. So the fit and finish, it's very good.
One thing we should definitely talk about here, since we're talking about now a real vintage watch review, is some things that you may see. We've certainly posted on Instagram recently from watch dealers, big and small, and some as big as they come, that say things like, due to the nature of vintage watches, we can't make any guarantee about the performance of a piece, which I can say is absolutely baloney. You should be ashamed of yourselves if you're stupid enough to buy from them, and you should be ashamed of yourselves if you conduct your business that way, because it's not true. These watches absolutely can perform. They were built in an era where they were meant to perform, where people depended on them to perform. So we're going to hear just how well they can perform.
Okay, so how well did it perform on the timing test after you did everything that you needed to do to bring it up to spec?
The overall rate is about -1 second on all 6 positions. I usually do 2 down as an additional position because that is more accurate, in my opinion, than just 3 down or crown down. In all 6 positions, now I can improve it to +1, +2, but it's irrelevant at that point.
Not to speak for you, you have to place different weights on the different positions, thinking of how often the watch will be in that position. So even if you average out the positions to -1, if that means that in actual daily wear, it's estimated to be at 0 or +1, that's good, because not all positions will occur at equal amounts of time.
You're absolutely correct, Chase, because often we give the average rate, and that includes a rate that maybe loses more time. For example, the crown up position, which is quite usual for a lot of mechanical watches. They're designed that way. So once you include that position, it could indicate that it is losing overall. But in reality, if the person does not put the watch in that position, then it will be gaining. So it's kind of more dependent on the person's wearing habits.
And even with the consideration of that person's wearing habits, you are talking about overall figures of -1.
Right.
That's pretty damn accurate.
Per day.
Right. So to say that these watches are not guaranteed to perform in any which way essentially means you are relying on someone to buy this and live with it, and that's their problem, not yours.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's move on. This particular watch, now that we've cleared up that it's not a fake, I am actually quite the fan. And everybody knows that I really don't like vintage watches. This particular watch doesn't really look as vintage as it would suggest, because it looks somewhat modern, cleaned up. It does have a little bit of the vintagey feel with the Air King font that looks terrible to me.
You're right. The one big contention I have is not that this piece had a refinished dial, but actually that the dial was refinished and it wasn't done up to the quality that it should have been. So why this had a refinished dial is because when this watch was made, it was full of radium on the dial and the hands, and I'm sure that the original dial was burnt to hell by now.
Well, everything considered, I think that Rolex Air King font has always been kind of goofy.
Agreed.
And I just don't like it. So simply put, everything aside from the Air King font, I quite like it because it's a very comfortable case. I tried it on and it's very close to what my 15200 is. And the most kind of striking feature about this thing and the most striking feature of Rolex of this era is my absolute favorite thing in the world. And that's the acrylic, because no matter which way you look at the damn thing, it's always got a serious amount of depth.
Yeah.
It just gives so much character to that watch. Now, I understand that sapphire is better for the watch.
But it's not always optically better. That's the key here. So I'm looking at the watch right now. I'm looking at it from a serious angle, and it's facing yours.
Yeah.
And yours, with the sapphire crystal, is reflecting it. I basically can't see the dial.
Correct.
Whereas this one, I can see it almost perfectly down to 90 degrees.
And yes, for a wearer, it may not be optimal because you can nick the watch on something, but visually, it's just such an impressive element. It just gives the watch so much more depth, so much more character. It's pretty. It's just pretty. It's just a good-looking watch. That's all I can tell you. And at 34 millimeters, for me, for a person my size, my wrist size, it's optimal.
This episode of On Time was recorded and engineered by Michael Senderovich with supervision by Tim Hatayama.
Team OTP is Kenshu Production and Savada and Dune on social media.
Our theme song was composed and recorded by Hubie Wang, and our expert on this episode is Manuel Yazigian. Follow him on Instagram at Manuel Watchmaker.
And while you're on Instagram, make sure to follow us as well at On Time Podcasts. For the entire OTP team, this is Mike.
And this is Chase. Thank you for listening to On Time.